In the quiet stillness of a maternity ward, where the miracle of life should bring nothing but joy, a sinister tension brewed. Maria Hudson, a new mother, basking in the glow of holding her newborn son, felt the weight of something unspoken. The sharp, judgmental gaze of a senior nurse, Lydia Crane, pierced through the warm moment, turning what should have been a sanctuary into a battlefield. Lydia, with her clipped words and icy demeanor, wasn't just there to perform her duties. There was something else, something darker. The nurse's subtle jabs and cold insinuations weren't just words. They were weapons, chipping away at Maria's confidence and dignity as a mother. But Maria wasn't prepared to give in. What Lydia didn't know was that beneath Maria's quiet exterior lay an unshakable resolve, a mother's instinct to protect her child at all costs. Before we dive into this gripping story of love, defiance, and justice, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're ready to stand by Maria in this tale of courage and resilience, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss a moment of the action. In the hushed stillness of Rosewood Maternity Hospital, the soft cries of newborns mixed with the rhythmic beeping of machines. In one room, Maria Hudson, a 28-year-old woman with a quiet yet resolute strength, cradled her newborn son. The exhaustion from hours of labor couldn't diminish the glow on her face. She had dreamed of this moment, holding her first child close, breathing in the intoxicating sweetness of new life. Yet, the air in her room felt heavier than she had expected. The source of her unease stood nearby, clipboard in hand. Lydia Crane, a senior nurse with decades of experience, wore an expression that could only be described as frosty. Her presence was a stark contrast to the warmth that usually accompanied such moments. While Maria tried to revel in her joy, Lydia's piercing gaze lingered on her, carrying a subtle disapproval that was hard to ignore. Bookmark, shall I take him now for his routine checks? Lydia asked, her voice clipped and devoid of any compassion. Maria instinctively pulled her baby closer. No, I'd like to keep him with me for now, she replied, her tone polite but firm. Lydia's lips pressed into a thin line. It's standard procedure, she continued, her tone hardening. We ensure the baby is healthy. Maria felt her heart race, an unfamiliar instinct flaring within her. There was something about Lydia's demeanor, a possessiveness in her stance, and a coldness in her eyes, that unsettled her. I appreciate that, Maria said carefully, but I'll wait a little longer. For a moment, Lydia's professional mask slipped, her gaze turned sharp, and her voice dropped to a tone laced with insinuation. You might want to consider what's best for him, she said, her words dripping with a judgment that Maria couldn't quite place. Maria felt her chest tighten. Excuse me? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Lydia smirked, her expression patronizing. Some children have better chances in more suitable circumstances, she said, her eyes flicking dismissively to the baby. The words hit Maria like a slap. She had faced her share of prejudice before, quick glances in grocery stores, whispered judgments at town gatherings, but to have it aimed at her as a new mother felt like a fresh wound. She clenched her jaw, steadying herself. I am his mother, Maria said firmly, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. Lydia raised an eyebrow, unfazed. Of course, she replied, her tone so sweet it felt condescending. She turned on her heel and left the room, her departure as cold as her arrival. The door clicked shut, leaving Maria alone with her baby, her emotions swirling. This was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of her life, but a storm of doubt and anger threatened to rob her of that joy. She held her son tighter, vowing silently that no one would make her feel unworthy of being his mother. Maria Hudson couldn't shake the unease left in the wake of Lydia Crane's unsettling words. She sat alone in the sterile hospital room, her newborn son resting peacefully in her arms. She traced a finger along his tiny, delicate hand, marveling at the miracle of his existence. Despite her exhaustion, Maria felt a fierce protectiveness building within her, a shield forged by the subtle yet sharp implications of Lydia's remarks. The hours passed slowly, each minute stretching with an oppressive quiet that only heightened Maria's apprehension. Every sound beyond the door made her stiffen, half expecting Lydia to return with another thinly veiled jab or demand to take her son. She replayed their earlier interaction in her mind, trying to make sense of the disdain in the nurse's eyes and the cruel insinuations in her tone. When Darren, Maria's husband, finally entered the room, his presence brought an immediate sense of relief. Darren, the hospital's director, was a steady force in her life. His calm, authoritative demeanor and deep love for his family had always been Maria's anchor. Yet, even as he kissed her forehead and admired their newborn son, she couldn't hide the tension etched across her face. "What's wrong?" Darren asked, his brow furrowing as he noticed her unease. Maria hesitated for a moment before recounting the encounter with Lydia. She described the nurse's cold tone, the way she'd looked at their son, and the insinuations that Maria wasn't capable of providing what he needed. Darren's jaw tightened, his usual calm demeanor giving way to a rare flash of anger. "She said that to you?" he asked, his voice low and steady but laced with fury. Maria nodded. "I didn't want to cause a scene, Darren, but I don't trust her. There's something about the way she looks at Isaiah, like she thinks he doesn't belong with us." Darren placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "I'll handle it," he said firmly. "You shouldn't have to deal with this, especially now." But Maria shook her head. "I don't want trouble, Darren. Just be here when you can. I feel safer when you're around." Darren reluctantly agreed, though the look in his eyes told Maria that he wasn't about to let Lydia's behavior go unchecked. He spent the rest of the afternoon by her side, holding Isaiah and helping Maria relax. But as evening approached, the demands of his position pulled him away. With a promise to return soon, Darren left, leaving Maria to face the growing shadows of her unease alone. Night fell, and the hospital grew quieter. The muffled sounds of nurses moving through the hallways and the occasional soft cry of a newborn filtered into Maria's room, but otherwise the silence was heavy. She tried to rest, but sleep eluded her. Every creak of the floorboards or rustle beyond the door made her heart race. Sometime past midnight, the door opened slowly, and Lydia stepped into the room. Her movements were deliberate, almost predatory, as she adjusted the blinds and checked the clipboard in her hand. Maria sat up, clutching Isaiah closer. "Good evening, Mrs. Hudson," Lydia said, her voice calm but devoid of warmth. Her eyes flicked briefly to Isaiah, then back to Maria. "How are you feeling?" Maria forced herself to keep her tone steady. "Tired," she replied, her grip tightening on her son. Lydia nodded absent-mindedly, her attention clearly elsewhere. "Understandable. That's why I think it's time we take the baby for his tests," she said, her tone leaving no room for discussion. Maria's pulse quickened. "You said earlier that the tests weren't urgent," she countered. "Well," Lydia said, her smile tight, "plans change. We need to ensure he's healthy. It's standard procedure." "I'll come with him," Maria said, her voice firm despite the fear crawling up her spine. Lydia's smile faded, replaced by a look of cold determination. "That won't be necessary," she replied smoothly. "Some tests require a sterile environment. It's best for him if he goes alone." Maria held Isaiah closer, her protective instincts flaring. "I don't see why I can't be there. He's my son." For a moment, Lydia's mask slipped and a flicker of frustration crossed her face. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Mrs. Hudson, I understand you're attached to your baby, but sometimes mothers don't always know what's best." Maria felt her anger surge. "What are you trying to say?" Lydia's gaze hardened. "I've seen situations like this before. Young mothers who think they can handle everything on their own but end up overwhelmed. I'm only trying to help." Maria's hands trembled with a mixture of fear and fury. "Isaiah has everything he needs," she said firmly, "and I'll decide what's best for him, not you." The tension in the room was thick, an unspoken battle of wills playing out between the two women. Finally, Lydia straightened, her expression cold and unreadable. "As you wish," she said, her tone icy. She turned and left the room without another word, the sound of the door closing behind her echoing like a final warning. Maria exhaled shakily, her heart pounding. She looked down at Isaiah, who remained blissfully unaware of the conflict surrounding him. She whispered softly to him, promising that no one would take him away from her. But deep down, Maria knew this wasn't over. Lydia's words and actions had made it clear she wasn't just trying to do her job. There was something far more sinister at play, and Maria would have to summon every ounce of her strength to protect her son from whatever came next. Maria Hudson woke the next morning after a restless sleep, her body aching from tension. Despite her exhaustion, she found herself hyper-alert, every nerve on edge. Isaiah lay nestled in her arms, his soft, rhythmic breathing a steady comfort. She glanced at the clock and realized Darren would still be tied up with his hospital duties. The door to her room opened quietly, and to her dismay, Lydia Crane stepped in again. This time, there was a sharper precision to her movements, and her demeanor was even colder than the night before. "Good morning, Mrs. Hudson," Lydia said, her tone brisk as she moved about the room, adjusting the blinds and checking the monitors. "I hope you're feeling better today." Maria adjusted her hold on Isaiah, her voice wary. "I'm fine, thank you." Lydia's eyes flicked toward the baby, her expression unreadable but heavy with intent. "Well, it's time we proceed with those tests," she said firmly. Maria's pulse quickened. "I told you before, I'll be staying with him." Lydia's lips pressed into a thin line, and she sighed as though dealing with a difficult child. "Mrs. Hudson," she began, her voice low but laced with impatience, "these tests are standard. They're routine. You're only making this harder by insisting on being present. Trust the professionals to do what's necessary." Maria stared at her, anger bubbling beneath her exhaustion. "I trust the professionals who respect me as his mother," she said sharply. Lydia's expression darkened, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the simmering resentment beneath. "You may think you know what's best, but new mothers often let emotions cloud their judgment. It's not unusual for someone in your circumstances." Maria stiffened, her grip tightening on Isaiah. "What circumstances are you referring to?" she asked, her voice low and trembling with controlled fury. Lydia's smile returned, but it was cold and devoid of any warmth. "Let's just say," she replied, "not every environment is equipped to provide the kind of stability a child needs." The insinuation hit Maria like a physical blow. She fought the sting of tears as she clutched Isaiah closer. "Isaiah has everything he needs, and I don't need anyone questioning my ability to care for my son." For a moment, Lydia's mask slipped entirely. Her eyes flashed with frustration, and her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You think love is enough?" she asked, her tone condescending. "Do you really believe that's all it takes to raise a child in a world like this?" Maria's breath caught in her throat, but her resolve didn't waver. "Yes," she said firmly, "because love is what gives me the strength to stand here and tell you to leave us alone." Lydia held her gaze for a moment longer before stepping back. "As you wish," she said, her tone clipped. "But don't think this is the end, Mrs. Hudson. Sometimes what's best for the child isn't what the mother wants to hear." With that, Lydia turned and left the room, leaving Maria shaking with anger and fear. Hours later, Darren returned, his face weary from meetings and rounds, but his expression softened when he saw Maria and Isaiah. He leaned over, kissing her forehead before sitting beside her. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. Maria hesitated, unsure how much to share. "Lydia was here again," she finally said. Darren's face hardened immediately. "What did she do this time?" "She's insinuating things," Maria said, her voice faltering, "that I'm not fit to raise Isaiah, that someone else could do better." Darren's jaw tightened, his calm demeanor slipping. "She's crossed the line," he said firmly. "I'll handle this, Maria. She has no right to make you feel this way." Maria reached for his hand, her grip desperate. "I don't want you to fight with her, Darren. I just want you to be here with us. I feel safer when you're close." Darren nodded, his expression resolute. "I'll stay," he promised. For the rest of the day, Darren remained by her side, his presence a steadying force. But Maria could sense the tension brewing within him, the simmering anger that he tried to keep hidden. She knew that Lydia's actions weren't just a professional issue for him. They were personal, an attack on the family he cherished. Later that evening, as the hospital grew quieter and the halls emptied, Maria found herself alone again. Darren had been called away unexpectedly, his duties pulling him from her side despite his promises. The silence in the room was suffocating, every creak of the floorboards or murmur beyond the door making her heart race. She tried to focus on Isaiah, his peaceful slumber, which was a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. But the unease Lydia had planted within her refused to be ignored. The door creaked open, and Maria's stomach dropped. Lydia entered again, her expression unreadable, but her eyes filled with cold determination. "What are you doing here?" Maria asked, her voice sharp, her hands instinctively pulling Isaiah closer. Lydia closed the door behind her, stepping further into the room. I'm here to ensure the well-being of the child, she said, her voice smooth but dripping with malice. Maria's heart pounded as she stared at the woman before her. You have no right, she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. You can't just take him. Lydia's lips curled into a faint smile, her eyes glinting with a dangerous confidence. You think you can protect him, she murmured, her voice low and almost taunting. But you don't understand. Sometimes what a child needs most is a mother who knows when to let go. Maria's blood ran cold, her grip on Isaiah tightening as she stared into Lydia's unyielding gaze. I will never let go, she said, her voice breaking with emotion, but unwavering in its conviction. At that moment, the door swung open, and Darren stepped into the room. His presence filled the space, and Lydia froze, a flicker of recognition and fear flashing across her face. What's going on here? Darren demanded, his voice cold and authoritative. Lydia faltered, her confidence crumbling as she struggled to explain. The tension in the room was this. The silent battle between Maria and Lydia laid bare before Darren's piercing gaze. This ends now, Darren said firmly, his words slicing through the silence like a blade. The room was heavy with tension, the silence pressing down like a storm waiting to erupt. Darren stood tall, his piercing gaze fixed on Lydia Crane. She hesitated, her usual confidence faltering under his presence. Maria sat on the hospital bed, clutching Isaiah protectively, her fear beginning to ebb as Darren's unshakable resolve filled the space. Well? Darren's voice cut through the stillness like a whip. What are you doing here, Nurse Crane? Lydia straightened her posture, forcing an air of professionalism that felt more like a mask than genuine authority. I was checking on Mrs. Hudson and the baby, she replied smoothly. It's my duty to ensure their well-being. Darren's jaw tightened, and he crossed his arms, his voice dangerously low. And is it standard practice to intimidate new mothers in their hospital rooms? Or to insinuate that their child would be better off elsewhere? Lydia flinched, her composure cracking for a moment. I was simply offering professional advice, she said, her tone defensive. It's my responsibility to assess the environment a child is being brought into. Maria spoke up, her voice trembling but firm. Your advice felt like an accusation, Nurse Crane. You've made it clear you don't think I'm capable of raising my son, and I won't tolerate it. Lydia's expression hardened, her eyes narrowing as she glanced between Maria and Darren. I've worked at this hospital for over 30 years, she said coldly. I know what's best for my patients, even if they don't always see it. Darren stepped closer, his presence commanding. You may have experience, Nurse Crane, but that doesn't give you the right to overstep your bounds or impose your prejudices on our family. This stops now. For a moment, Lydia said nothing, her face a mask of barely concealed defiance. But as Darren's unwavering gaze bore into her, she relented, stepping back with a stiff nod. Very well, she said, her voice clipped. I'll make a note of it in their records. She turned and left the room, her departure leaving behind an air of unease. The door clicked shut, and Maria exhaled shakily, her body sagging with relief. Darren turned to her, his expression softening as he sat beside her on the bed. Are you all right? He asked gently, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Maria nodded, though the tension in her voice was unmistakable. I don't understand why she's doing this. What gives her the right to judge us like that? Darren's jaw clenched again, his protective instincts flaring. She doesn't have that right. And she won't get another chance. I'll make sure of it. The next morning, Darren's words were put to the test. A nurse knocked on Maria's door, her face anxious as she informed Darren that the hospital's board of directors had called an emergency meeting. They've requested your presence in conference room B, the nurse said quietly, her eyes flicking nervously toward Maria. Darren frowned, his instincts immediately on high alert. The board? At this hour? What's this about? The nurse shifted uncomfortably. I don't know, sir. I was just asked to let you know. Darren turned to Maria, his face filled with quiet determination. Stay here, he said, squeezing her hand. I'll be back as soon as I can. Maria nodded, her voice steady but worried. Be careful, Darren. I don't trust her. Darren strode through the hospital corridors, his mind racing as he approached the conference room. When he entered, the atmosphere was tense. The board members sat around a long table, their expressions ranging from serious to uncertain. At the far end of the room stood Lydia, her posture stiff and her face set in a mask of calm defiance. Mr. Hudson, one of the senior board members, Dr. Harris, greeted him with a nod. "Thank you for joining us on short notice." Darren took a seat, his gaze flicking between Lydia and the rest of the board. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice even but laced with suspicion. Dr. Harris cleared his throat, glancing at Lydia before continuing. "Nurse Crane has brought a matter to our attention regarding the well-being of your son." Darren's eyes narrowed, his patience wearing thin. "What matter?" Lydia stepped forward, her voice calm but calculated. "I've raised concerns about the environment in which Isaiah is being cared for. As a medical professional, it's my duty to report any situation that could pose a risk to a child's development or safety." Darren's fists clenched beneath the table, but his voice remained steady. "And what grounds do you have for making these claims?" Lydia didn't flinch. "In my professional opinion, there are signs of instability. Mrs. Hudson's insistence on being overly attached to the child, combined with certain external factors, raises questions about whether this environment is in the child's best interest." The thinly veiled accusation was enough to make Darren's blood boil. He leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "This is my family, Lydia. Your opinions don't entitle you to interfere in our lives or question our ability to care for our child." Another board member, a woman named Dr. Patel, cleared her throat nervously. "Nurse Crane has filed an official complaint," she said carefully. "It's our responsibility to investigate." Darren's voice dropped, his words sharp and deliberate. "So, because of her personal grievances, you're questioning my wife's right to be a mother? Her ability to care for the child we've waited so long to welcome into this world?" Lydia met his gaze, her tone unwavering. "This isn't personal, Mr. Hudson. It's about what's best for Isaiah." Darren rose from his seat, his anger no longer concealed. "This ends now," he said firmly, his voice echoing through the room. "I won't stand by and let you use your position to tear apart my family under the guise of concern." Lydia's expression flickered with frustration, but she didn't respond. Darren turned to the board, his tone resolute. "If this hospital allows personal biases to dictate its decisions, then it has failed its mission. I won't allow it." Without waiting for a response, Darren left the room, his steps purposeful, as he returned to Maria's side. Back in Maria's hospital room, the tension hung thick as the minutes crawled by. She tried to calm her nerves, holding Isaiah close and whispering soft reassurances to him, though they were as much for herself as for her child. Darren's absence weighed heavily on her, and the knowledge that Lydia had taken her complaints to the hospital board sent a chill down her spine. The door opened suddenly, and Darren walked in, his expression a storm of controlled anger. Maria looked up, her heart pounding. "What happened?" she asked, her voice taut with worry. Darren came to her side, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Lydia filed a formal complaint with the board," he said quietly, his voice thick with restrained frustration. "She's questioning your ability to care for Isaiah." Maria's face paled, her hands instinctively tightening around her son. "She what? Darren, how can she do that? This is our son. We're his parents." Darren nodded, his expression grim. "She's manipulating the system, Maria. She is using her position and the guise of professionalism to try to undermine us. But I won't let her succeed." Tears welled in Maria's eyes, her voice breaking. "She doesn't know us, Darren. She doesn't know the love we have for Isaiah, or how much we've fought to build this life. How can she think she has the right to take that away?" Darren pulled her into his arms, his voice firm yet gentle. "She won't," he promised. "I will not let her take him from us. You're his mother, and no one, especially not Lydia, has the right to challenge that." Maria nodded against his chest, drawing strength from his words. But even as his presence steadied her, a gnawing fear lingered. Lydia wasn't just an overbearing nurse. She was a woman emboldened by her own sense of righteousness, and that made her dangerous. Hours later, as the hospital descended into its usual evening quiet, the sound of approaching footsteps broke Maria's fragile sense of calm. The door swung open, and Lydia entered the room, her demeanor colder than ever. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 hospital security officers flanked her, their presence a silent testament to the gravity of the situation. Maria sat up, clutching Isaiah protectively. Darren, who had been standing by the window, turned sharply to face Lydia, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury. "What is this?" Darren demanded, his voice cold and commanding. Lydia stepped forward, her tone clinical as she addressed them. "Mr. and Mrs. Hudson, the hospital board has authorized a temporary removal of Isaiah for further observation. We believe it's in his best interest." Maria's heart sank, panic gripping her as she shook her head. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're not taking him. You have no right." Lydia's expression remained impassive, though her tone carried a subtle edge. "This is not a request, Mrs. Hudson. It's a directive. We're acting in the best interest of the child." Darren stepped in front of Maria, shielding her and Isaiah from Lydia's gaze. His voice was sharp, his words cutting. "If you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you bully us into handing over our child, you're gravely mistaken. This is our son, and we decide what's best for him, not you." Lydia's calm mask cracked for a split second, a flash of irritation crossing her face. But she quickly regained her composure, her tone chillingly detached. "Mr. Hudson, this decision was made by the board. If you refuse to cooperate, we will have no choice but to escalate the matter." Maria's voice broke as she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. Please don't do this. He's our son. We're his parents. You can't just take him from us." For a fleeting moment, Lydia's expression softened, a flicker of something almost human in her eyes. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold resolve that had defined every interaction she'd had with them. "I'm doing what I believe is right," she said quietly. "You'll understand in time." Just as the words left her lips, the door burst open, and a commanding voice filled the room. "That's enough, Nurse Crane." All heads turned as Dr. Victor Green, one of the hospital's most senior board members, entered the room. His stern expression and authoritative presence instantly shifted the balance of power. Lydia froze, her composure visibly cracking under his piercing gaze. "Dr. Green," Lydia began, her voice faltering. "You were overstepping your bounds," Dr. Green interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I've reviewed your complaint, Nurse Crane, and it's clear to me that your actions are not only unprofessional but deeply inappropriate." Lydia opened her mouth to respond, but Dr. Green silenced her with a raised hand. "This is not how we handle situations in this hospital. You've let your personal biases cloud your judgment, and in doing so you've caused unnecessary fear and distress to this family." He turned to Maria and Darren, his tone softening. "Mr. and Mrs. Hudson, I deeply apologize for the pain and fear this has caused you. Please know that you have full support from this hospital." Relief flooded Maria's face as she clutched Isaiah close, tears streaming freely. Darren placed a protective arm around her, his gratitude evident even as his anger lingered. Lydia, meanwhile, stood frozen, her mask of professionalism completely shattered. Her face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation as she realized the depth of her miscalculation. "Effective immediately," Dr. Green continued, "you are placed on leave, Nurse Crane. A full investigation into your actions will follow, and your presence is no longer required at this hospital." Lydia's expression twisted with disbelief. "Dr. Green, I was only trying to—" "This discussion is over," Dr. Green said firmly. "You've lost the trust of this family and, for now, of this hospital. I suggest you take this time to reflect on the responsibilities and limitations of your role." The room fell silent as Lydia nodded stiffly, her face a mixture of defiance and resignation. She turned and left without another word, her departure marked by the echo of her retreating footsteps. Maria exhaled shakily, the tension finally breaking as she leaned into Darren's embrace. For the first time in what felt like days, she allowed herself to breathe freely, the weight of Lydia's threats lifting. The door to Maria's hospital room clicked shut behind Lydia Crane's retreating figure, and the silence that followed felt almost surreal. Maria clung to Isaiah, her trembling arms steadying as Darren placed a protective hand on her shoulder. Dr. Victor Green stood nearby, his presence a calming force amidst the chaos that had unfolded. Maria looked up at Dr. Green, her voice soft but resolute. "Thank you," she said, her words carrying the weight of her gratitude. "I didn't know what else to do. She just wouldn't stop." Dr. Green gave her a reassuring nod. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Hudson," he said firmly. "What you've been through is unacceptable, and I can assure you it won't happen again. Nurse Crane's actions were not only unethical, but also in direct violation of this hospital's principles. Darren stepped forward, his expression still taut with lingering anger. "This isn't just about her conduct," he said, his voice low but steady. "Lydia tried to manipulate us. She used her position to impose her prejudices and make us question our rights as parents. That kind of behavior doesn't just hurt us, it undermines everything this hospital stands for." Dr. Green met Darren's gaze, his own expression serious. "I understand, Mr. Hudson. That's why I'll be handling this matter personally. Lydia Crane's actions will be thoroughly investigated, and appropriate measures will be taken to ensure this never happens again." Maria felt a wave of relief wash over her at Dr. Green's words. For the first time since Lydia had begun her relentless campaign against her, Maria felt seen, heard, and protected. As the hours passed and the hospital began to quiet for the night, Maria and Darren finally had a moment to reflect on the whirlwind of events. They sat together on the small hospital bed, Isaiah resting peacefully between them. "She was so certain, Darren," Maria said quietly, her voice tinged with disbelief. "It wasn't just about her authority. It was like she truly believed she was doing the right thing." Darren nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "That's what makes it worse," he said. "She convinced herself that she had the right to decide what was best for our son, and she thought nothing of tearing us apart to prove it." Maria's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away, her resolve hardening. "We can't let this happen to anyone else," she said. "What if she's done this before? What if there are other families who've gone through the same thing and didn't have anyone like Dr. Green to step in?" Darren reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Then we'll make sure that changes," he said. "This hospital needs to do better. Lydia Crane may be gone, but the system allowed her behavior to go unchecked. We can't let that continue." Maria nodded, her determination mirrored in Darren's expression. The next morning, the hospital's board of directors convened to discuss the fallout from Lydia's actions. Dr. Green, true to his word, took the lead in addressing the issue, presenting a detailed report of her conduct and its impact on the Hudson family. The board's decision was swift and decisive. Lydia Crane was officially terminated from her position, and her nursing license was under review. The ban is ending the further investigation. It was a stunning fall from grace for a woman who had spent decades building her reputation at the hospital. News of Lydia's dismissal spread quickly among the staff, many of whom were shocked by the revelations. While some quietly expressed sympathy for her, others admitted they had long been wary of her rigid, often judgmental approach to patient care. For Lydia, the reality of her actions began to set in. Stripped of her authority and reputation, she found herself facing the consequences of her choices. The hospital that had once been the foundation of her career was now a place where her presence was no longer welcome. Meanwhile, Darren and Maria's focus shifted toward healing and moving forward. Darren, ever the problem solver, began working with Dr. Green and the hospital's leadership team to implement new policies aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. "We need to create a culture of accountability," Darren said during one of their meetings. "This hospital should be a place where every patient feels safe, respected, and valued, no exceptions." Under Darren's guidance, the hospital introduced enhanced training programs for staff, emphasizing empathy, inclusivity, and cultural sensitivity. Regular reviews of employee conduct were also put in place to ensure that no one could exploit their position of authority as Lydia had. For Maria, the experience became a catalyst for advocacy. Encouraged by Darren and bolstered by the support of friends and family, she began sharing her story with others. "At first I thought I was alone," Maria said during a community event, her voice steady despite the emotion behind her words. "But I've learned that so many others have faced similar challenges. If my story can help even one person find their voice and stand up against prejudice, then it was worth sharing." Maria's courage resonated deeply with those who heard her speak. She connected with other parents and families, many of whom had their own experiences of feeling judged or marginalized. Together, they formed a network of support, advocating for greater awareness and change within the healthcare system. As the days turned into weeks, Maria and Darren settled back into their lives with a renewed sense of purpose. Their bond, already strong, had been fortified by the trials they had faced together. One quiet evening, as Maria watched Isaiah sleeping peacefully in his crib, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. The storm that had threatened to tear their family apart had instead brought them closer, revealing their resilience and the power of their love. "Darren," she said softly, turning to her husband who was sitting nearby. "I know this isn't over. There will always be people like Lydia, people who think they have the right to judge us." Darren nodded, his gaze steady. "And there will always be people like us," he replied. "People who will fight back, who will stand up for what's right. Together, we'll face whatever comes next." Maria smiled, a quiet strength shining in her eyes. She reached for Darren's hand, their fingers intertwining as they sat in the stillness of the moment. Lydia Crane's world unraveled faster than she could comprehend. For decades, she had been a pillar at the hospital, respected, even feared, for her strict adherence to rules and her commanding presence. But now, as she walked out of the hospital for what might be the last time, her career lay in ruins. The board's decision to terminate her position had been swift and public, the humiliation a stinging reminder of how far she had fallen. As she sat in her car, the reality of her actions washed over her. She had convinced herself that she was doing the right thing, that her judgment was superior, and that the Hudson family needed her intervention. But now, stripped of her authority, Lydia was left with only the stark truth. She had overstepped in a way that could never be justified. Despite the clarity of her downfall, Lydia clung to a flicker of defiance. In her mind, she had acted out of a sense of duty, even if the world now saw her as a villain. "They'll see," she muttered to herself as she drove away from the hospital, the bitter taste of regret mixing with stubborn pride. One day, they'll understand. But understanding and forgiveness proved elusive. Word of Lydia's actions had spread beyond the hospital, tainting her reputation in the broader medical community. Her attempts to find work at other institutions were met with polite but firm rejections. Few were willing to take a chance on someone whose record was marred by such a high-profile scandal. The whispers followed her wherever she went. Former colleagues avoided her in public, their once friendly greetings replaced with awkward glances. For Lydia, who had always prided herself on her reputation, the isolation was unbearable. Meanwhile, the Hudson family began to rebuild their lives, finding strength in the community that had rallied around them. Maria, in particular, found her voice as an advocate, her experience becoming a beacon of hope for others who had faced similar struggles. "It's not just about us," Maria said during a gathering of parents and community members. "This is about ensuring that no one else has to feel the way we did, that no one has their abilities or love for their child questioned because of someone else's prejudice." Her words resonated deeply, sparking conversations about implicit bias and the need for systemic change. Maria worked alongside Darren to create resources for parents and to push for broader accountability in healthcare. Their combined efforts began to make waves, inspiring others to take action and share their stories. One day, while attending a town hall meeting, Maria was approached by a woman who had been listening quietly from the back of the room. Her face was lined with years of struggle, but her eyes held a spark of determination. "Thank you," the woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've never had the courage to speak up about what my family went through, but hearing you, it makes me believe that maybe I can." Maria's heart swelled with both empathy and pride. "You can," she said softly. "Your story matters, and the more we share, the more we can change." While Maria and Darren forged ahead, Lydia's attempts at redemption grew increasingly desperate. She reached out to Dr. Victor Green, hoping to appeal to his sense of fairness and regain a foothold in the hospital. "Dr. Green," Lydia said during a strained phone call, her tone measured but tinged with frustration. "You've known me for years. You know I've always put the hospital and its patients first. Surely you can see that I was trying to do what I thought was best." Dr. Green's response was firm but compassionate. "Lydia, I don't doubt that you believed you were acting in the hospital's interest, but your actions crossed a line that should never have been approached, let alone crossed. This wasn't about what was best for Isaiah. It was about your assumptions, your biases, and the damage caused by that can't be undone with an apology." Lydia bristled, but she knew there was no arguing with him. The conversation ended with a finality that left her feeling more isolated than ever. Weeks turned into months, and Lydia's name became a cautionary tale within the medical community. Her once imposing presence was reduced to a memory of what could happen when power was misused. For Maria, the passage of time brought healing, though the scars of her experience lingered. She and Darren remained committed to their advocacy work, channeling their pain into a mission that strengthened their bond and their resolve. One afternoon, as Maria and Darren strolled through the park with Isaiah, they were approached by an unfamiliar face. It was a young nurse from the hospital, her expression warm but hesitant. "Mrs. Hudson, Mr. Hudson," the nurse began, "I just wanted to say, I'm so sorry for what you went through. I was new to the hospital when it happened, and I didn't know how to speak up. But seeing how you've turned this into something so positive, it's inspired me to do better in my own work." Maria smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "The fact that you're willing to reflect and grow from this means a lot. That's how we create real change." The nurse nodded before walking away, leaving Maria and Darren with a renewed sense of purpose. That evening, as the Hudson family returned home, Maria found herself reflecting on everything they had endured. The pain, the fear, the moments of doubt, it had all been worth it to protect Isaiah and to ensure that their experience could spark a greater movement. Darren, sensing her thoughts, placed a hand on her shoulder as they stood by Isaiah's crib. "We made it through," he said softly, "and we're stronger for it." Maria nodded, her eyes brimming with quiet determination. "We are," she agreed. "And we'll keep fighting, not just for Isaiah, but for every family that needs to know they're not alone." As they stood together, watching their son sleep peacefully, Maria felt a profound sense of gratitude. Their journey had been fraught with challenges, but it had also revealed the depth of their love and their resilience. In the end, the Hudsons knew that their story was far from over, but whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, their bond unbreakable and their purpose clear. Months after the ordeal with Lydia Crane, the Hudson family had found a rhythm of normalcy, yet the echoes of that harrowing experience continued to shape their lives. Darren, ever the diligent advocate, had taken on the challenge of reshaping the hospital's culture. Maria, on the other hand, had emerged as a quiet but powerful force in the community, her voice becoming a rallying cry for other families who had faced prejudice or systemic neglect. Bookmark. One crisp autumn morning, Maria stood at a podium in the town's community center, addressing a crowd that had gathered to discuss patient rights and inclusivity in healthcare. Among the audience were parents, medical professionals, and hospital administrators, including Darren, who sat in the front row with Isaiah resting peacefully in his lap. Maria's voice was steady, her words heartfelt. "When I was in the hospital with my son, I thought I was alone," she began, her eyes sweeping the room. "But I've since learned that our story isn't unique. So many families have faced moments where their abilities, their love, and their very humanity were called into question. What happened to us was painful, but it also showed us something important. We are stronger when we stand together." The crowd murmured in agreement, the weight of her words resonating deeply. Maria continued, sharing not just her experience, but the changes she and Darren had worked to implement at the hospital. "This isn't just about my family," she said. "It's about creating a system where every parent, every patient, feels respected and valued. No one should ever have to fight for their dignity in a place that's supposed to offer care and compassion." Her speech concluded with a standing ovation, the room filled with a renewed sense of purpose. Darren joined her on the stage, offering her a proud smile as he handed her Isaiah. Together, they stood as a symbol of resilience and hope. Back at the hospital, Darren's reforms were beginning to take root. Staff members participated in mandatory workshops on implicit bias and cultural competency, and the hospital's policies were updated to prioritize transparency and patient advocacy. One initiative Darren spearheaded was the creation of a patient advisory board, which included members of the community who could provide feedback on their experiences and suggest improvements. Maria became one of its first members, her insights proving invaluable in shaping the hospital's future. During one meeting, a young nurse nervously raised her hand. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she said, her voice tentative. How do we make sure something like that doesn't happen again? Maria leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. It starts with empathy, she said. We have to stop seeing patients as just cases or charts. We need to see them as people, as families, with their own unique challenges and strengths. Darren nodded, adding, and we need to hold ourselves accountable. It's not enough to say we're against discrimination. We have to actively work to eliminate it. The room buzzed with agreement, and the discussion shifted toward actionable steps the hospital could take. For Maria, it was a moment of quiet triumph, a sign that their efforts were making a difference. Meanwhile, Lydia Crane's life had taken a drastically different turn. Stripped of her position and reputation, she struggled to find a path forward. Her attempts to rebuild her career were met with resistance, her name now synonymous with overreach and prejudice. Lydia spent her days in relative isolation, reflecting on the choices that had led to her downfall. For the first time, she began to confront the biases she had long dismissed as mere professional instincts. She read articles and attended seminars on cultural sensitivity, not out of obligation, but out of a genuine desire to understand where she had gone wrong. But even as she sought redemption, she couldn't escape the consequences of her actions. One day, while grocery shopping in town, Lydia spotted Maria in the next aisle. Maria was chatting with another mother, her laugh light and genuine as Isaiah clutched her hand. Lydia hesitated, her instinct to retreat battling with a flicker of courage. Slowly she approached, her presence startling Maria slightly. "Mrs. Hudson," Lydia began, her voice subdued. I wanted to say that I'm sorry. For everything." Maria regarded her carefully, her expression unreadable. The silence between them stretched for a moment before Maria finally spoke. "Lydia," she said, her tone measured, "I hope you understand that your apology doesn't undo what happened. The fear you caused, the damage you could have done to my family, it wasn't something I'll ever forget." Lydia's shoulders sagged, and she nodded. "I know," she said quietly. I needed to say it. For what it's worth, I've been trying to change, to be better." Maria studied her for a moment longer before giving a small nod. "I hope you do," she said simply, her tone firm but not unkind. Lydia offered a faint, bittersweet smile before turning and walking away, leaving Maria with a sense of closure she hadn't expected. That evening, Maria shared the encounter with Darren as they sat together in their living room, Isaiah playing nearby. "Do you think people like her can really change?" Maria asked, her voice thoughtful. Darren considered the question, his gaze steady. "I think people can change if they truly want to," he said. "But the question is whether they'll use that change to make amends, or just to ease their own guilt." Maria nodded, her fingers brushing over Isaiah's curls as she watched him play. "I guess only time will tell," she said softly. For Maria and Darren, the focus remained on the future, on continuing to fight for a world where no family would have to endure what they had. Their journey wasn't just about healing their own wounds. It was about creating a legacy of empathy, resilience, and justice. As they watched Isaiah laugh and explore, they felt the weight of their responsibility, but also the joy of knowing that they were shaping a better world for him. Together, they stood strong, united by the love that had carried them through their darkest moments and into a brighter tomorrow. Months passed, and the Hudson family settled into a life of newfound purpose. The challenges they had faced had left scars, but they also forged a deeper resolve within Maria and Darren to advocate for justice, equity, and empathy. Their journey had evolved beyond their own healing. It had become a mission to uplift others who had felt silenced or dismissed. Maria's voice grew stronger as she continued her advocacy work. Her story, shared at community events and through local media, resonated with parents who had faced their own struggles with prejudice or bias. She worked with Darren and the patient advisory board at the hospital, helping to shape policies and provide a much-needed perspective from someone who had lived through the system's failings. One afternoon, Maria was invited to speak at a statewide healthcare summit. It was her largest audience yet, and though nerves prickled at the edge of her confidence, she knew the importance of what she had to say. Darren stood backstage with her, holding Isaiah, his steady presence grounding her as she prepared to step into the spotlight. "You're going to be amazing," Darren said, his voice warm with pride. Maria smiled, her hand brushing over Isaiah's tiny curls. "It's not about me," she said softly. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we did." The summit hall was packed, the energy palpable as Maria walked onto the stage. She took a deep breath, her voice clear as she began. "My name is Maria Hudson," she said, her gaze sweeping the audience. "And I'm here to tell you a story, not just mine, but one that reflects the experiences of so many families who have felt unseen, unheard, or judged in the places where they sought care." She recounted her ordeal with Lydia Crane, her words vivid but not bitter. She spoke of the fear, the anger, and the resilience it had taken to stand firm against someone who had tried to undermine her right to be a mother. But she also spoke of the change that had come from that pain, the reforms at the hospital, the strength of community support, and the importance of confronting prejudice in all its forms. "We all have a responsibility," Maria said as she closed her speech, "to ensure that our healthcare systems don't just treat illnesses, but also honor the dignity of every patient who walks through their doors. It's not enough to say we care, we have to show it every day, in every interaction." The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that filled Maria's heart with gratitude. As she stepped off the stage, Darren met her with a wide smile, Isaiah clapping his tiny hands as if mimicking the crowd's enthusiasm. Bookmark. At the hospital, Darren's reforms were beginning to make a tangible impact. Staff members embraced the new training programs, and the atmosphere grew more inclusive and empathetic. Patients reported feeling heard and valued in ways that hadn't always been the case before. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of a family-first policy, which ensured that parents could remain with their children during medical procedures unless absolutely impossible. The policy was directly inspired by Maria's insistence on staying with Isaiah during his tests, a moment that had sparked an institutional shift. Maria often visited the hospital, not as a patient but as an advocate and advisor. During one such visit, she was approached by a young mother cradling her newborn. "Mrs. Hudson," the woman said shyly, her eyes glistening with emotion. "I just wanted to thank you. My baby was in the NICU for a week, and because of the new policies, I got to stay with him the whole time. I don't know how I would have managed without that." Maria's heart swelled, and she reached out to squeeze the woman's hand. "You're exactly why we do this," she said. "Every parent deserves to be with their child, no matter what." As the Hudsons' advocacy work grew, so did their family's reputation in the community. They were no longer just Maria and Darren. They were symbols of resilience, champions for fairness, and a testament to the power of love in overcoming adversity. Their efforts didn't stop at the hospital. Maria began collaborating with other organizations, helping to create resources for parents navigating the healthcare system and offering support to those who felt marginalized or ignored. Darren, meanwhile, started hosting regular town hall meetings at the hospital, inviting patients and families to share their experiences and ideas for improvement. "We're not perfect," Darren said during one such meeting, "but we're listening, and we're committed to doing better. This hospital belongs to all of us, and it's our job to make sure it serves everyone with dignity and respect." Lydia Crane, now a shadow of her former self, remained on the periphery of these changes. Her attempts to rebuild her career had largely failed, and though she continued to attend workshops and seminars on bias and ethics, she struggled to shake the stigma of her actions. Occasionally, whispers of her resurfaced, stories of her seeking positions at smaller clinics or volunteering in community programs. But the trust she had once commanded was gone, and her presence was more often met with suspicion than acceptance. For Maria and Darren, Lydia's absence from their lives was a relief, though her impact lingered as a reminder of what they had endured. One evening, as Maria prepared dinner and Darren played with Isaiah in the living room, she glanced out the window at the fading sunset. The golden light bathed their home in warmth, a stark contrast to the storm they had weathered months before. "We've come so far," Maria said softly as Darren joined her in the kitchen, Isaiah perched on his hip. Darren smiled, his hand brushing against hers. "We have," he agreed, "and it's only the beginning." Maria looked at him, her heart full. "No matter what comes next, we'll face it together," she said. "Always," Darren replied. As they stood there, watching Isaiah giggle and reach for a toy, they felt a deep sense of peace. Their journey had been fraught with challenges, but it had also brought them closer, forging a bond that could withstand anything. Together, they were ready for whatever lay ahead. Years passed, and the Hudson family's life blossomed in ways Maria and Darren could never have imagined during those dark days at the hospital. Isaiah grew into a curious, compassionate child, surrounded by a community that had rallied around him and his family. For Maria and Darren, their journey had transformed into a legacy, not just for their family, but for countless others who had drawn strength from their story. Isaiah's laughter echoed through their home one sunny afternoon as he chased butterflies in the backyard. Maria watched him from the porch, her heart swelling with pride. Darren stepped outside, carrying 2 mugs of tea, and handed one to her as he took a seat beside her. "He's growing up so fast," Maria said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "It feels like just yesterday I was holding him in that hospital room, wondering how we'd protect him from the world." Darren reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "We've done everything we could to make sure he grows up surrounded by love and strength," he said. "And look at him now. He's happy. He's thriving." Maria nodded, her eyes glistening as she watched Isaiah dart across the yard. "It was all worth it," she murmured. "Every fight, every sleepless night, it was worth it." Their advocacy work had expanded far beyond what they had initially envisioned. Maria became a sought-after speaker, her story inspiring healthcare providers, community leaders, and policymakers to reevaluate how they approached patient care and equity. She worked closely with Darren and other hospital administrators to develop statewide initiatives aimed at improving inclusivity and patient rights. One of their most impactful projects was the creation of the Isaiah Initiative, a program dedicated to supporting families navigating healthcare challenges. The initiative provided resources, counseling, and advocacy for parents who felt marginalized or overwhelmed by the complexities of the system. The program's success brought Maria and Darren to the attention of national organizations, and soon they were traveling across the country to share their insights and strategies. Despite the demands of their work, they remained grounded in their commitment to each other and to Isaiah. "Our family comes first," Maria often reminded Darren during their busiest moments. "Everything we do is for him and for families like ours." The hospital where their story began had undergone its own transformation. Darren's leadership and Maria's input had fostered a culture of accountability and empathy. The staff, once wary of change, embraced the new policies and practices that prioritized patient dignity and respect. Dr. Victor Green, who had played a pivotal role in supporting the Hudsons, often reflected on the hospital's progress. "It's incredible how far we've come," he said during a meeting with Darren. "And it's thanks to people like you and Maria who turned a painful experience into a catalyst for change." Darren nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's been a team effort," he said, "but there's always more work to do." Dr. Green smiled. "With leaders like you, I have no doubt we'll continue moving forward." Meanwhile, Lydia Crane's story had taken a different path. The former nurse, once a dominant presence in the hospital, had faded into obscurity. Her attempts at redemption were met with mixed results. She had taken on volunteer roles in community health programs, working quietly and away from the spotlight she once commanded. One day, while attending a community healthcare workshop, Lydia overheard a conversation about the Isaiah Initiative. The speakers praised the program for its impact, highlighting Maria's tireless efforts to create a more compassionate healthcare system. Lydia listened in silence, a pang of regret coursing through her. She realized that while she had once wielded authority, Maria had built something far more enduring: trust, respect, and a legacy of hope. Back at home, Maria and Darren prepared for an event celebrating the 5th anniversary of the Isaiah Initiative. The gathering brought together families, healthcare professionals, and advocates who had been touched by the program's work. Maria stood on the stage, Darren and Isaiah by her side as she addressed the crowd. Her voice was steady, her words carrying the weight of their journey. "When we started this, we didn't know how far it would go," Maria said, her gaze sweeping the room. "We just knew we wanted to create a world where every parent felt supported, Every child felt safe, and every family had a voice. Today, seeing all of you here, I know that we're on the right path. The crowd erupted in applause, the energy in the room a testament to the program's impact. Isaiah, now 6 years old, tugged at Maria's hand and whispered, "Mommy, can I say something?" Maria smiled and handed him the microphone. "Go ahead, sweetheart." Isaiah stepped forward, his small voice carrying through the room. "Thank you for helping my mommy and daddy," he said, his words simple yet profound. "Because of you, we're happy." The audience melted into applause and laughter, the heartfelt moment solidifying the evening's theme of unity and hope. As the night wound down, Maria and Darren stood outside the venue, watching the families and guests disperse. Isaiah dozed off in Darren's arms, his head resting on his father's shoulder. "We've come so far," Maria said softly, her voice filled with awe. Darren nodded, his gaze steady. "And we're just getting started." Maria turned to him, her hand resting on his arm. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together," she said. "Always," Darren replied, a promise in his voice. As they walked to their car, the cool night air wrapped around them like a gentle embrace. Their journey, though marked by challenges, had brought them to this moment, a life filled with love, purpose, and an unbreakable bond. The Hudsons knew that the road ahead would hold its own trials, but they were ready. Together, they had built something extraordinary. A family fortified by resilience, a community strengthened by advocacy, and a legacy of hope that would inspire generations to come. The story of Maria, Darren, and their fight to protect their son Isaiah is a poignant reminder of the strength and resilience that lies within us when faced with prejudice and adversity. What began as a moment of joy, the birth of their first child, was quickly overshadowed by the systemic biases personified in Lydia Crane's actions. Yet, through unwavering love, determination, and the courage to stand up for what's right, Maria and Darren turned their pain into a powerful catalyst for change. Their journey teaches us that every individual, regardless of their background, deserves respect, dignity, and compassion. It reminds us that prejudice, whether overt or subtle, has no place in our institutions, especially those meant to heal and protect. Darren and Maria didn't just fight for their family. They paved the way for countless others to feel empowered, supported, and seen. The story also sheds light on the importance of accountability. Lydia's downfall wasn't just about one person. It was a call to action for the entire hospital to confront its own flaws and build a culture rooted in empathy and fairness. It's a testament to the power of leadership, advocacy, and community in creating meaningful change. At its heart, this story is about love that protects, perseveres, and inspires. Maria and Darren's bond carried them through their darkest moments, proving that when families unite against injustice, they can overcome even the most formidable challenges. If this story moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? Did it resonate with your own experiences? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And share your own stories with us, moments of resilience, hope, or change that shaped your life. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more heartfelt and meaningful stories like this one. Share your thoughts about Maria and Darren's journey in the comments below. And let's keep this conversation going. Together, we can inspire, uplift, and create a better world for all. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.